Hello people, and welcome to The Great Everything, an exploration into culture, ethics, and what it means to be human. I'm Patrick, a former banking lawyer who saw the light and quit to dedicate my life to my two great passions, culture and philosophy. Today I want to talk a little about change, because one of the most fascinating insights I find in world philosophy, but also world religion to be fair, is this idea of the world as constant change, as made up of not things, but processes. There's a similar idea in Buddhism with its notion of impermanence, anicca, with the accompanying intuition that clinging to things that are merely transient and destined to change is one of the main causes of human suffering. In the West, we have the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who cites change as the fundamental nature of the universe. Pantare, he writes, everything flows, just like a river. River into which you can never really step twice, because that second time, it's no longer even the same river. And crucially, it's no longer the same you. The world around us does feel like it's constantly changing. Think of the leaps forward in science and technology, how fast they happen, seemingly overnight. You wake up and suddenly the landscape we move in is just radically changed. Think of the rapid evolution of our cultural habits and our ethical commitments. Think about politics. Just the other day it felt like we were all out there celebrating how liberal democracy is on the rise. And now you have rising authoritarianism in America, of all places. In Russia, Putin just won an election with 77% of the vote. It sounds legit. In China, Xi Jinping is pretty much dictator for life now. Talk about whiplash. And we as humans on the individual level, we're also constantly changing, We grow, we evolve, we learn from our experiences, hopefully. We undergo traumas, that profoundly change our relationship with ourselves and the world. And our bodies, they're changing too, in biological terms, this cycle of growth and decay. Or illnesses. My mother's brain cancer, that's a transformation of the body too. But also it's a transformation of who she is at a fundamental level. Her character, her personality, those are all different now. Then there are some voluntary changes like tattoos and cosmetic surgery. And of course, sex change, transitioning from a body that feels like it doesn't fit you to one that does. It feels like we've embraced this idea of constant change on a macro and a micro level. And learning to live with that change is perhaps one of life's great challenges, and hopefully one of its rewards as well. So I'm talking about all this because it's the 20th of March, and that's the birthday of a poet who I feel more than any other artist or author or musician really embodies this idea of the world as change, as transformation. Metamorphoses, you might say. I'm talking, of course, about the Roman poet Ovid, who was born today in 43 BC. His full name was Publius Ovidius Naso. Naso is a nickname. It means big nose. And so my friend Diego, he always jokes that it probably means that Ovid was Jewish, but I'm not sure that's politically correct. Ovid wrote about love and sex and myths, but his magnum opus is the Metamorphoses, which is a collection of poems about ancient myths, which are all centered around the theme of transformation, of change, and it's also one of the main sources for ancient mythology that we have. Ovid begins the work with this verse, quote, "I want to tell about how bodies transform into other bodies." And what can I say? He keeps that promise. And you're probably familiar with a lot of these stories, from Greek and Roman myth. You got Arachne, who wins this weaving contest against the goddess Minerva, Athena, and is transformed into a spider. There's a story of Hermaphroditus who, spoiler alert from the name, but he's both man and woman. Or she, maybe? I don't know. Then you have Pyramus and Thisbe, the original Romeo and Juliet story, with these two lovers from rival families who can't stand each other. And they fall in love and they can communicate with this through a crack in the wall separating their properties. And then they run off together, and through a series of misunderstandings, they end up committing suicide, just like Romeo and Juliet. And the blood from their stab wounds, it stains a nearby mulberry tree, which determines the fruit's color from there ever after. There's the story of Io, whom Jupiter transforms into a cow to hide her from his wife Juno's jealous eyes. But, don't worry about Io, because Ovid assures us that, quote, "even as a cow she was lovely." That's charming. So these are all stories about bodily transformations. But also, they're stories about how our different psychological states literally turn us into different creatures. I mean, our violent emotions in Ovid, they turn us into beasts. Ovid sees us as becoming lions or wolves. Our suffering makes us howling grief. So these emotional states, they change, and when that happens, you change as a whole. And the body change is just a physical manifestation of our constant inner transformation. Now, there's something a little pessimistic about all of these stories. I mean, none of us wants to, be transformed into a spider, but we shouldn't see them as negative. We shouldn't see change as a bad thing. At times, it clearly is. It's a punishment, like when the seer Tiresias, he's forced into a sex change because he pissed off the goddess Juno. So he gets transformed into a woman, a prostitute even. Other times, though, it's a reward or an act of pity. So I mentioned Arachne. What happens there, it's not one of those classic tales where the goddess loses a contest and then in an act of spite transforms the mortal winner into something bad. In this case, Arachne wins the contest and then through a series of circumstances hangs herself. And Athena comes across the body dangling from a rope and is overcome with pity. And so she transforms Arachne. She saves Arachne by transforming her into a spider so that Arachne can continue weaving her beautiful web for eternity. I mean, one could ask why, if Athena was so overcome with pity, why she didn't just revive Arachne in her human form. But, it probably doesn't make for as good a story. And at other times, often I'd say, this transformation is like a release from suffering. Like with Daphne, right? Daphne is a nymph. Apollo, the god, falls in love with the nymph and, it hurts me to say this, but he wants to fuck her. And she's having none of it. So he starts chasing her and she's running away and she starts crying and praying to be saved from her, would-be rapist. And her prayers are heard. And so she gets transformed into a tree, a laurel tree. And that allows her to escape her captor, Apollo. So this sounds a lot like Buddhism, doesn't it? This idea of nirvana as a release from the human experience. Ovid says it in kind of Buddhist terms, quote, "Happy is the man who has broken the chains which hurt the mind and has given up worrying once and for all." You don't really get more Buddhist than that. Ovid's world is basically like a heightened version of our own. And these stories about change and transformation and metamorphosis, they allow us to experience a kind of archetypal vision of the world in constant flux. Quote, "All things change, nothing is extinguished. There is nothing in the whole world which is permanent. Everything flows onward. All things are brought into being with a changing nature. The ages themselves glide by in constant movement." And, quote, "As wave is driven by wave, and each pursued pursues the wave ahead, so time flies on and flies and follows, always forever and new. What was before is left behind. What never was is now, and every passing moment is renewed." It's beautiful. But Ovid wasn't just the poet of myth and change and transformation. He was also mainly the poet of human passions. So I mentioned the psychological states that in a way are the true core of these physical metamorphoses he writes about. But the emotional state he was most fascinated by is love and lust. He wrote fantastic collections about great love affairs and the art of love, ars amatoria. And that was probably part of his downfall. So Ovid was a bit of an irreverent fellow. He was a member of Rome's Bohemian crowd. Picture them as an intellectual elite that you could compare to the Studio 54 crew in the 70s in New York, right? Andy Warhol, David Bowie, people like that. These guys in ancient Rome, they were metrosexual, they were cross-dressing, they were very modern. Except the problem with this is that he was living, Ovid, at a really bad time for all this stuff. Augustus was in power, the first emperor, and he'd ushered in a new golden age for Rome. It was the beginning of the empire, and that had come after a century of civil wars between, people like Sulla and Marius and Pompey and Caesar and Mark Antony and Augustus himself. And one of the causes people like Augustus had identified for the fall of the Republic and that previous era of strife was a decay in morality. So once he was in power, Augustus enacted all these reforms to get the status quo back to the good old Roman times, when women were respectable and men kept it in their pants and everyone was virtuous, the good old Roman virtues. This was kind of like an early precursor to a sort of Victorian morality, with things such as adultery being outlawed. And in all this, Ovid was going around fucking anything that moved, and also bragging about it in his poems. I mean, if you look at Ars Amatoria, it really is nothing less than a manual for successful adultery. So Augustus had tolerated all of this for quite a while, for years, but suddenly, just like that, Ovid was exiled from Rome, and he was sent to this distant corner of the empire in current Romania on the shores of the Black Sea. This was an outpost. It had miserable weather. There was no art, no libraries, no entertainment, no nothing. Pretty much nobody spoke Latin. There were just some Roman legionaries and barbarians. To Ovid, this was hell on earth. It was the worst thing that could ever happen to such a bohemian guy, and he stayed there until he died. Now, nobody knows what he did to deserve this fate, what the straw was that broke the camel's back. In a letter back to Rome, Ovid spoke of his Carmen et Error, a poem and a mistake. The poem was probably the Ars Amatoria, which had been published years earlier without it being punished, but which, when the time for a decision came on Ovid, it must have weighed against him quite heavily. But what the mistake Ovid mentions is, well, that's a mystery. There are clues that, Ovid hanging out with the hottest and most desirable men and women in Rome, he might have seen something he shouldn't have seen in high society and was being kept away from Rome on purpose so that didn't get divulged. Around that time, we know of a sex scandal that erupted in Rome, in the high society, and that somehow involved the emperor's own granddaughter, Julia, who was a notorious philanderer, fucker about her. And she was also exiled from Rome, by the way, no matter what her connection to Augustus was. And some believe that Ovid may have witnessed something regarding her, perhaps even incest. And so he had to be removed. Or maybe he had just slept with the wrong person. Could it have been Julia herself? We'll never know. But be that as it may, Ovid lived out the rest of his days on this obscure outpost, far from civilization, far from the cosmopolitan inputs and the pleasures that had made him, well, Ovid. Change of a most significant kind caught up with him as well. And we can only hope that he learned something from that experience, because as he himself said, perfer et obdura, be patient and tough. One day this pain will be useful to you. I wonder if it was ever useful to him. So today, 20th of March, if you will, take a moment to read just a couple of lines by Ovid. He was a remarkably modern and relatable poet and man, and his understanding of the world as constant change, and his profound compassion for both people and gods, with all their flaws and their mistakes and their passions and desires, they make him one of the most profoundly human artists I've ever encountered. Quote, I am dragged along by a strange new force. Desire and reason are pulling in different directions. I see the right way and approve it, but I follow the wrong.
Can you dig it?
I ain't embarrassed to use the word.
Can you dig it?
I'm talking about ethics.
Can you dig it?
Damn it, Patrick!
You silver-tongued devil,
Hey guys, thanks for listening. I do hope you enjoyed today's diary edition of The Great Everything. And if you did, I would be massively grateful if you would consider, well, showing some love, basically. And you can do that by adding me on social media. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, the usual places people hang out. If you can do that, it would be a massive boost to my self-esteem, credibility, and just to my prospects, frankly. But also, preferably, if you could please leave a review or a rating, whichever is available, wherever it is you listen to The Great Everything. That's iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, all these places. I'm also on Spotify, I think. Basically, wherever podcasts exist, The Great Everything exists also. And if you can leave a rating there, a review, it would really be massively appreciated by me. It would help me grow big time, I think. You see, I do this for free. I've been doing it for a year now. I will always do it for free, and it's quite a commitment in terms of time and effort, mental energy and all that. And I love doing it because there's nothing more beautiful to me than spreading culture, some ideas, and preferably hearing back from you on those ideas as well. So anything you can do to help me keep doing that, even if that is just showing some love, and that really is all I ask, that would be wonderful. I mean, it's all I ask, really, but if you also want to send me some Girl Scout cookies, I'm totally down for that.
The podcast you just heard was recorded with Anchor. If you want to make your own, download the Android or iOS app completely free from anchor.fm/podcast. That's anchor.fm/podcast.